They say the war is over. The troops are coming home. But what if that's only part of the story? From Vietnam to Iraq to Afghanistan, the United States has followed a pattern. Pull out the soldiers, but leave the bases, the drones, the private contractors. The names of the missions change, the presidents change, even the enemies change. But the war machine keeps turning. Billions flow to defense contractors. New threats are always around the corner, and the boots on the ground are quietly replaced by shadow operations. We call it peacekeeping. We call it counterterrorism. But what it really is never leaving. The Forever Wars is the untold story of how America ends wars on paper, but stays in them forever. For over half a century, America has claimed to fight for freedom, justice, and global stability, but when the shooting stops, the US rarely packs up and goes home. This documentary reveals a hard truth. America doesn't end wars, it extends them, reshapes them, and rebrands them. The result is a pattern of endless conflict, where withdrawal is just an illusion, and victory is replaced by occupation. From the jungles of Vietnam to the deserts of Iraq and the mountains of Afghanistan, the US has left behind sprawling bases, shadow networks, and private armies. Wars that were sold as short-term interventions become decades-long entanglements, driven by shifting missions, changing enemies, and the powerful interests of defense contractors and political agendas. While politicians declare missions accomplished, the boots stay on the ground, if not in uniform, then in the form of contractors, drones, and covert forces. Behind every exit strategy is a hidden presence, and behind every enemy is a justification to stay. The American war machine is no longer just a reaction to threats, it's a self-sustaining system powered by fear, media spin, and unchecked global ambition. This series uncovers how laws meant to limit war have been twisted into open-ended permissions, how public attention is redirected while bosses multiply, and how new threats like cyber warfare and great power competition keep the cycle alive. The war doesn't end, it evolves. The Forever Wars isn't just about the past. It is a look into how endless conflict has become America's new normal and why walking away may no longer be part of the plan. We will discuss the documentary in 10 logical parts. Now start with part 1. In American politics, few words sound more triumphant than withdrawal. It suggests closure, victory, and coming home. Presidents use it to declare wars over, to promise the end of bloodshed and the beginning of peace. Troops march out, flags are folded, and headlines celebrate the supposed end of yet another chapter in American military history. But behind that carefully choreographed pageantry lies a deeper, more uncomfortable truth America rarely ever leaves. The wars may change in name or tone, but the presence remains. In fact, in most cases, the US simply shifts how it stays, not whether it stays. Take Korea. After the Korea War, armistice was signed in 1990. The United States didn't dismantle its presence, it entrenched it. 70 years later, roughly 28,500 American troops still guard the Korean peninsula. The war never officially ended, and neither did America's role in it. The base structure, command networks, and joint military exercises have all continued decade after decade. Vietnam offers a more haunting example. After a brutal and unpopular war, US combat troops officially withdrew in 1973 under the Paris Peace Accords, but the story didn't end there. The CIA, Marine Guards, and covert pilots with Air America stayed active, facilitating missions until the very last helicopter lifted off from the US Embassy in Saigon during Operation Frequent Wind in 1975. What happened in Vietnam became a template. Declare the war over for the public, keep a limited footprint for optics, and shift the burden from soldiers to shadows. The US would no longer always fight its wars in full view, but it would never stop fighting them either. This pattern evolved into what military insiders now call a 5-step drill. Step 1. Declare victory or transition, using phrases like mission accomplished, or advise and assist. These terms calm the public and signal political wins without fundamentally altering military posture. Step 2. Rotate out uniformed troops. The number of boots on the ground becomes a political number, useful for press releases but detached from reality. It's not about ending the war, it's about lowering the body count in the headlines. Step 3. Bring in the private sector. By the final years of the Afghanistan war, there were more than 18,000 US defense contractors operating in country compared to just 2,500 active duty troops. That's a 7-to-1 ratio. These contractors provided everything from logistics and transportation to intelligence, support and armed security, essentially running the war without the oversight or accountability of a formal military operation. Step 4. Leave behind a small footprint force. Today there are still 2,500 US troops in Iraq, performing what the Pentagon calls non-combat roles. Yet these roles include drone coordination, intelligence gathering, and special operations support. Step 5. Expand the global web. While the public believes wars are ending, the Department of Defense is expanding. AFRICOM, the U.S. military's Africa Command, maintains at least 46 known or semi-secret outposts in 24 African nations. These bases operate under vague legal authorities and often without full congressional disclosure. Most Americans don't even know they exist. This sprawling presence is rarely acknowledged because it operates in the shadows. Congressional authorizations for the use of force are stretched to apply in places and scenarios never intended by lawmakers. War powers are diluted, and oversight becomes an afterthought. Meanwhile, drone strikes continue. Special forces rotate in and out under training or advisory missions, and private contractors sign multi-billion-dollar no-bid contracts to extend their operations indefinitely. The military might be leaving the battlefield, but it's not leaving the region. For the Pentagon, this model works. It's politically clean, strategically flexible, and financially rewarding for contractors. The military avoids direct confrontation with war-weary voters while maintaining forward operating capacity around the world. It's war without the war-weariness. As one U.S. general once put it bluntly, we leave the combat phase. We don't leave the neighborhood. It's a phrase that perfectly captures how the forever wars operate, not through occupation or invasion, but through persistent, quiet control. In this new age, ending a war doesn't mean bringing everyone home. It means rebranding the mission, reducing visibility, and keeping the U.S. positioned at the center of global conflict zones. The result is a nation that never truly leaves, only shifts how it stays. Part 2. Vietnam, the first forever. War. Vietnam was supposed to be a limited conflict, American effort to stop the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. But what began as military advisors in the 1950s spiraled into one of the longest, most controversial wars in U.S. history. By the time the last combat troops officially left in 1973, more than 58,000 Americans were dead. Millions of Vietnamese civilians and fighters had perished, and the country was torn apart at home and abroad. Yet even after the so-called end, the U.S. didn't fully exit. It never does. The Paris Peace Accords in 1973 allowed the U.S. to declare withdrawal. But in reality, the intelligence war continued. CIA operatives remained on the ground, advising, training, and preparing South Vietnamese forces for the inevitable collapse. American pilots, flying under civilian cover like Air America, kept running missions in Laos and Cambodia. The fall of Saigon in 1975 was not just the end of a war, it was a wake-up call. The image of U.S. helicopters evacuating desperate allies from rooftops became a national trauma. It also taught the Pentagon and policymakers a lesson. Never again allow a war to collapse on live TV. Vietnam shaped the DNA of every conflict that followed. The Pentagon realized that if wars couldn't be won outright, they needed to be controlled in how they were perceived. This meant minimizing American deaths, using proxies, and fighting in ways that avoided media scrutiny. This is where the modern forever war was born. No longer was the goal to win decisively, but rather to maintain influence, prevent collapse, and avoid the optics of defeat. In Vietnam, the U.S. learned how to retreat while still staying. After 1975, U.S. involvement in Southeast Asia didn't just evaporate. Covert funding continued to anti-communist groups across the region. U.S. intelligence helped coordinate refugee flows, track Soviet activity, and monitor China's growing footprint. The battlefield changed, but the mission did not. Back home, the war changed. American politics forever. Trust in government collapsed. The Pentagon Papers exposed the deception. Multiple presidents had misled the public, escalating a war they privately believed was This seeded the public's growing skepticism toward all future military engagements. The military, humiliated, restructured itself for what would come next. The All-Volunteer Force was born in 1973, ending the draft and shifting to a professional military model. This allowed future wars to be fought without triggering nationwide protests, since fewer families had skin in the game. At the same time, Vietnam veterans returned home to a divided and often hostile nation. Many felt betrayed, sent to fight a war that was never meant to be one, and then abandoned by the same country they served. The wounds weren't just physical. Vietnam became the first war America lost and couldn't forget. And yet, ironically, it became the blueprint. In Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, the U.S. would later use local forces to absorb the fighting, keep American casualties low, and rely heavily on contractors, drones, and intelligence networks, just like it began doing in the final days of Vietnam. Even the evacuation scenes would echo. In 2021, the fall of Kabul looked almost identical to Saigon. Disparate crowds, rooftop extractions, and a sudden Taliban takeover after years of U.S. training and spending. History, it seemed, had rhymed. But what few realize is that Vietnam never truly ended. America simply reclassified its involvement, from war to containment, from soldiers to spies. The framework of influence spaces in the Pacific, defense deals, surveillance posts was all part of the same continuum. Vietnam proved that America doesn't always need to win wars. It just needs to shape the outcome, limit the chaos, and avoid defeat on its own terms. This mindset would guide every major U.S. intervention for decades to come. In many ways, Vietnam was America's first forever war, not because it never ended in headlines, but because it never ended in structure, strategy, or memory. It taught Washington how to stay even after leaving. The jungles of Southeast Asia became a warning and a blueprint. Future wars would be built around its lessons. Stay off TV, limit casualties, shift the burden, and always keep a foothold. In Vietnam, America lost the war but found a new way to fight them forever. Now Part 3, The War on Terror, redefining the battlefield. September 11, 2001, changed everything. The Twin Towers fell, the Pentagon burned, and nearly 3,000 American lives were lost in a single morning. But what followed wasn't just a hunt for terrorists. It was the opening chapter of a new kind of war, one that had no borders, no end date, and no clear enemy. It was a war designed to be permanent. Within weeks, the US launched airstrikes in Afghanistan. The mission: dismantle Al-Qaeda, destroy the Taliban, and prevent another 9/11s. But as soon as boots hit the ground, objectives started shifting. By 2003, the Bush administration had expanded the battlefield into Iraq, chasing phantom weapons of mass destruction and linking Saddam Hussein to terrorism, a claim that would never hold up. The war on terror wasn't just a conflict. It became a doctrine. It gave the US military and intelligence community a blank check, legal, political, and financial, to operate anywhere, anytime, against anyone deemed a threat. From Somalia to Pakistan, the battlefield stretched globally. Congress authorized the AUMF authorization for use of military force just days after 9/11s. That one document, only 60 words long, has been used to justify military action in over 22 countries across 4 administrations. It became the legal backbone of America's forever wars. In this new war, geography no longer mattered. The US didn't need to conquer territory. It only needed access, drones, and intelligence. New bases appeared across Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia, many unofficial, many undisclosed to the public. And then came the rise of the targeted kill list. For the first time, US presidents authorized drone strikes as routine policy, often far from declared battlefields. Signature strikes, where targets were killed based on behavioral patterns, not confirmed identity, blurred the line between combat and assassination. Drones turned war into data. Satellites, sensors, and remote pilots could eliminate a village in Yemen without risking a single American life. But with this power came collateral damage. Entire families were wiped out by mistake. Yet, because there were no US boots on the ground, there were no headlines, no protests, no accountability. The war on terror also created a vast network of private contractors and black ops units. From Blackwater to KBR, private companies raked in billions. They built bases, flew missions, protected diplomats, and sometimes engaged in direct combat, free from the rules of military law. Meanwhile, special operations forces exploded in size and scope. Units like Delta Force and SEAL Team 6 conducted night raids, hostage rescues, and high-value kill missions across dozens of countries, often under complete secrecy. These elite troops became the sharp end of an invisible spear. In Guantanamo Bay, the war redefined justice. Terror suspects were held indefinitely, without trial. Enhanced interrogation, what the world called torture, became official policy. The US built a global network of black sites, ghost prisons where even the Geneva Conventions seemed optional. The financial cost was staggering. By 2021, the US had spent over $8 trillion on the war on terror. That's $8 trillion on conflicts with no clear end, no lasting victory, and no real accountability. Defense contractors flourished, politicians talked security, but year after year, more money flowed in. Public support faded. Americans grew tired. But the war adapted. As troop numbers fell, the infrastructure remained. The bases, the contracts, the intelligence networks all stayed in place. And so did the missions, under new names: stabilization, counterterrorism, advise, and assist. By the time the last American troops left Afghanistan in 2021, many Americans assumed the war was over. But behind the scenes, drones still flew, special ops teams still deployed, and US money still propped up operations around the world. The war had simply changed its face. The war on terror did more than redraw the battlefield. It redefined warfare itself. No longer about occupation or invasion, America's new wars became invisible, automated, and endless, fought with algorithms, armed contractors, and silent airstrikes. What began as a response to 9/11s became a machine all its own. The war on terror didn't just rewrite the rules of combat. It erased the line between war and peace. And once that line vanished, America found itself in a new reality where war never really starts and never really ends. Part 4. Private wars, contractors, cash, and control. For most Americans, war looks like soldiers in uniform, carrying rifles, flying flags, and answering to the US government. But in the world of the forever wars, that's only half the story. Behind the headlines and military briefings, there's another army, invisible, private, and wildly profitable. These are America's private military contractors, and they've changed the way modern war is fought. After 9/11, the US military grew fast, but the demands of fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan grew faster. The Pentagon needed more hands, more weapons, more so it turned to the private sector. What began as a support role fixing vehicles, cookie food, quickly expanded to combat, intelligence, drone operations, and even interrogations. By 2007, the number of contractors in Iraq had surpassed the number of US troops. In Afghanistan, the same thing happened. At the war's peak, for every one American soldier, there were 7 contractors. And unlike soldiers, contractors weren't subject to military law, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, or even strict congressional oversight. This created a shadow force, an unofficial army fighting America's wars without the burden of accountability. One of the most infamous names was Blackwater, a private security company whose operatives opened fire in Baghdad's Nisa Square in 2007, killing 17 civilians. The backlash was swift, but the contracts kept coming. Why? Because private war is good business. The Pentagon started pouring billions into companies like KBR. These firms didn't just offer labor, they offered deniability. If a contractor died, there were no military funerals on the news, no flag-draped coffins, just a body flown home quietly, with no questions asked. Contractors could go places soldiers couldn't. Africa, Yemen, Syria, Libya. With no formal declarations of war, the US government used private firms to skirt around legal obstacles. They carried out missions, protected VIPs, and ran surveillance, often with little paper trail. Then came the drones. Many of the operators behind America's killer drones weren't soldiers at all. They were private tech workers and contractors. Sitting in Nevada or Virginia, they launched missiles in Somalia, Pakistan, and beyond. The machinery of war was now outsourced, automated, and sanitized. Even intelligence became privatized. The CIA relied on contractors for analysis, fieldwork, and logistics. Former special forces operators were hired by corporations to run black ops under private cover. Sometimes they worked for the US, sometimes for foreign governments, tech firms, or whoever paid best. This privatization blurred the lines of loyalty. Who are these people fighting for, the country or the contract? The answer often didn't matter, as long as the mission got done. But the long-term result was a fractured accountability system, where war crimes were harder to prosecute and responsibility was easily deflected. And the cost? Staggering. From 2001 to 2021, the US spent over $14 trillion on war. More than half of that went directly to defense contractors. Companies that made missiles, maintained bases, or flew surveillance drones made massive profits, some doubling or tripling in value during wartime. War became an industry, one where success wasn't measured in peace or stability but in contract renewals, stock prices, and political donations. Retired generals moved seamlessly into boardrooms. Defense firms lobbied Congress with millions. War wasn't just policy, it was a business model. Meanwhile, American voters were left in the dark. The rise of contractors meant fewer boots on the ground, fewer casualties to report, and less pressure on politicians to explain the mission. The wars could continue indefinitely, quietly, off-screen, and out of mind. This outsourcing of war allowed the US to wage permanent campaigns with temporary faces. Contractors rotated in and out, unseen by the public, while installations and missions stayed the same. The war never left, it just changed uniforms. By shifting from soldier to contractor, from mission to market, the US redefined how it fights. No longer needing full public support, war became something done for the state, by private hands, for a profit. The cost wasn't just money, it was oversight, transparency, and ultimately, democratic control. In the age of the forever wars, the battlefield doesn't always look like one. It's coded into spreadsheets, managed from corporate offices, and carried out by people who may never wear a uniform. America didn't just privatize war, it franchised it. And once that machine started rolling, it never stopped. Part 5. Bases everywhere. The empire without borders. You don't need to conquer the world when you can rent it. That's the logic behind America's global network of military bases, more than 750 installations, spread across at least 80 countries. No empire in history, not Rome, not Britain, has ever matched it. It's a footprint so vast, it's almost invisible to the average American. But to the rest of the world, it's impossible to ignore. These bases are more than buildings. They're launch pads for power, airstrips, intelligence hubs, drone hangars. Special forces nest there, the backbone of the forever wars. Some are sprawling like small city, like Ramstein Air Base in Germany. Others are secretive in bare-bones lily pads tucked into corners of Africa or Southeast Asia, capable of hosting strike teams on a moment's notice. Why so many? Because presence is power. A base in a region signals commitment. It deters enemies, reassures allies, and allows instant response without declaring war. The US doesn't need to invade when it can just fly in from next door. After World War II, the US military stayed in Europe and Japan to prevent another global war. But the Cold War turned temporary stations into permanent garrisons. The fall of the Soviet Union didn't change the strategy, it only expanded it. New bases went up in the Middle East, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe. Each new conflict brought a new footprint. After 9/11, the US opened bases in Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Bahrain, Qatar, Djibouti, and more. Some were close to battlefields. Others were strategically placed along key choke points, oil routes, shipping lanes, borders with Russia or China. And not all bases are created equal. Some are public, protected by treaties. Others are unacknowledged, black sites used by the CIA and JSOC for rendition, interrogation, or staging covert operations. These shadow locations are the true edge of the forever war, where official deniability meets real-world action. Critics call it an empire in all but name. While America doesn't fly its flag over conquered land, it controls more military real estate abroad than any nation in history. These installations act like satellites projecting force, gathering intel, shaping politics. The cost is immense. Every year the Pentagon spends over $100 billion just to maintain overseas bases. That's more than most nations' entire military budgets. And yet, the strategic logic remains. It's cheaper to be there already than to arrive late. In many host countries, US bases are politically sensitive. Some locals see them as jobs and security. Others see them as occupation. In Okinawa, Japan, protests have raged for decades. In Germany, opposition parties demand troop withdrawals. But the US stays because leaving would mean giving up leverage. These bases often come with status of forces agreements, deals that give American personnel immunity from local laws. That's led to scandals, abuses, but SOFAs also reflect the underlying truth. The US isn't just a guest, it's the senior partner in almost every military relationship it touches. And what about the new frontiers? In space and cyberspace, the Pentagon is already planning its next layer of global presence. Space Force now operates satellite commands from bases around the globe. Cyber commands run quiet wars from underground bunkers in places like Maryland and Hawaii. Some bases serve as staging grounds for proxy wars, supplying allies in Yemen, Syria, or Ukraine. Others are built to contain rising powers: China, Russia, Iran. The US doesn't need to fight everywhere. It just needs to be ready everywhere. Meanwhile, the American public remains largely unaware. There's no national debate over these bases, no primetime coverage. They're not considered wars, even though they often enable or escalate them. Permanent war becomes permanent peacekeeping. America's bases shape diplomacy, protect trade, and send a constant message. We are watching, and we are here. The forever wars couldn't function without them. They are both the engine and the armor. So while other nations rely on borders, America relies on forward presence, and presence, once established, is hard to walk away from. In the age of the forever war, the world itself becomes the battlefield, and America is always already there. Part 6. Exit Wars. Why leaving doesn't mean it's over. When America says it's leaving, that's rarely the end of the story. In the forever wars, withdrawal doesn't mean peace, it often means a pivot, a rebranding, a change in posture. Troops may come home, but the war machine stays on standby, because the US doesn't just fight wars, it manages conflicts. Take Iraq in 2011. President Obama announced a full withdrawal. The mission was over. The troops were coming home. But behind the victory speeches, thousands of contractors remained. Special forces units stayed in undisclosed roles, and the US Embassy in Baghdad, the largest in the world, became a fortress of permanent influence. Just 3 years later, American warplanes were bombing Iraq again, this time against ISIS. Troops returned under the label of advisors. The war had simply evolved, and that's the pattern. Declare an end, change the mission, and keep going under a new name. Afghanistan followed the same script. After 20 years, the US withdrew in 2021. But even as the last planes lifted off from Kabul, drone strikes continued, and CIA networks remained in place. Intelligence operations shifted to over-the-horizon capabilities, strikes launched from distant bases, satellites, and private contractors. What we call leaving is often just outsourcing. Instead of boots on the ground, we send drones, mercenaries, or money. Instead of soldiers, we deploy apps, advisors, and surveillance. The US doesn't end wars, it just steps back from the spotlight. That's because exit carries political weight. Presidents get points for bringing troops home, even if the war continues in other forms. Ending a war sounds good in speeches, but behind the scenes, the Pentagon rarely shuts a door completely. Every withdrawal comes with a contingency plan and a return ticket. In Somalia, the US withdrew in 2021 only to return months later. In Syria, Trump declared victory in an exit, but special forces stayed behind to guard oil fields and coordinate raids. In Libya, America officially stepped out, but covert operations and proxy support never stopped. Even when the flag comes down, the influence remains. The US leaves behind trained local forces, funded governments, armed militias, and critical intelligence ties. These relationships ensure that America's hand stays on the chessboard, even when the pieces are foreign. Exit also creates power vacuums, and Washington knows it. Leave too fast, and terrorist groups fill the gap. Stay too long, and the local population turns hostile. The result, a revolving door of intervention, where leaving becomes the first step toward returning. Sometimes the US wants out, but the system doesn't. Defense contractors, intelligence agencies, and regional allies push for continued engagement. Wars are expensive, but for some, they're profitable, politically useful, and strategically necessary. The machine doesn't slow down just because the media moves on. The narrative of exit is often more about domestic politics than foreign reality. Saying we're done wins votes, but the footprint of war, logistical, economic, digital, remains firmly in place. Bases are left intact, weapons systems stay deployed, and cyber operations continue without pause. There's also the fear of perception. US leaders worry that real withdrawal signals weakness, and so the exits become partial, careful, and often temporary. We leave by downsizing, not disengaging, by using drones instead of divisions, by shifting from public war to private enforcement. Exit doesn't just affect the battlefield, it reshapes the enemy. Groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS use American withdrawals as propaganda. They frame it as victory, even if the fight continues. Meanwhile, new enemies emerge faster, more decentralized, harder to track. Ultimately, the forever wars thrive on uncertainty. There's always a new threat, a new partner, a new reason to stay involved. In this landscape, exit is never final. It's just a pause in motion, a step back before the next strike. So when America exits, it doesn't really leave. It adapts, it watches, it hovers just over the horizon, because in the age of endless war, departure is never the end. It's just another part of the cycle, a quieter chapter in a story that refuses to close. Part 7, The Cost of Forever. Trillions trauma, and the price we pay, not just in blood but in dollars, trauma, and time stolen. For over 2 decades, the forever wars have drained America's coffers, fractured its military families, and left scars that don't heal with a flag-folding ceremony. These costs aren't always visible, but they are massive, and they're mounting. From 2001 to 2021, America spent over $8 trillion on the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and related operations. That includes not just combat expenses, but the interest on the debt used to fund them. Trillions poured into military campaigns, reconstruction efforts, contractor payments, and homeland security expansions. To put it plainly, that's $300 million every single day for 20 years. Enough to fund universal health care, cancel student debt, or rebuild America's crumbling infrastructure many times over. But in the shadow of war, other national needs were quietly sidelined. Then there's the human cost. Over 7,000 American service members died in the post-9/11 wars. But the number that haunts even more is 30,000. That's how many US veterans have died by suicide during the same period. That's 4 times the number killed in combat. Because the battle doesn't end when the uniform comes off. Veterans return with invisible wounds, PTSD, brain injuries, depression. Many face long waits for care at underfunded VA hospitals. Some struggle to reintegrate into civilian life, find work, or even stay housed. Beyond the troops, the civilian toll is staggering. In Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and elsewhere, at least 387,000 civilians have been directly killed by violence. Indirect deaths from disease, displacement, and infrastructure collapse likely push that number into the millions. In countries like Yemen and Somalia, where US operations have supported proxy wars or drone strikes, families live under constant threat, often without even knowing who is targeting them or why. Drones don't explain themselves. Missiles don't ask questions. Meanwhile, the forever wars have made the defense industry rich. The top 5 US military contractors, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, General Dynamics, and Northrop Grumman, have seen their profits skyrocket. Their lobbyists pour millions into Congress to keep the contracts flowing. And it's not just corporations. Washington itself has become tangled in a revolving door. Generals retire and join defense boards. Policymakers go into private security, and contractors return as government advisors. The war business is deeply embedded in America's political class. What about future costs? The US is expected to spend $2.2 trillion more just on care for veterans of post-9/11 wars. That includes medical support, disability payments, and mental health treatment for decades to come. These are costs that extend long after the last shot is fired. There's also the psychological cost to a generation raised during endless war. For young Americans, conflict abroad has become normal, something that's always on, always somewhere, always someone else's problem. The effect is a quiet numbness, a fading of civic responsibility and public debate. For the soldiers, repeated deployments have taken a brutal toll. Marriages fall apart, children grow up without parents, The suicide rate for active duty troops is now at its highest in decades. The human machinery of war is burning out and the system keeps pushing forward. Even democracy itself pays a price. War powers have drifted from Congress to the executive branch. Decisions about life and death, war and peace, are often made without public consent or even awareness. Endless war has slowly eroded the constitutional balance of American governance. And yet, despite all this, few in Washington talk seriously about it. There are no war taxes, no national service requirements, no draft. The burden is carried by a small slice of the population, while the rest of the country moves on. War is background noise, expensive, deadly, but distant. So the forever wars aren't just about where America fights. They're about what America sacrifices to keep fighting. And the answer, as always, is more than we realize. Dollars, bodies, minds, time, truth, it's all part of the cost. And once it's spent, we rarely get it back. Part 8. Narratives of Freedom. How America sells endless war to itself. No war lasts forever without a story to justify it. In America, the forever wars are powered not just by missiles or drones but by narratives. These are the messages crafted in press rooms, delivered in presidential speeches, echoed on cable news. Freedom, safety, democracy, justice. They don't just explain the wars, they sustain them. After 9/11s, the message was simple and searing. They hate us for our freedom. It framed the war as a moral crusade, good versus evil, liberty versus terror. Overnight, complex geopolitical struggles were rebranded as a global fight for American values. That framing worked. Americans rallied behind the flag, the troops, the mission. Support was overwhelming, but as months turned to years and targets shifted from Osama bin Laden to Saddam Hussein, then to Taliban warlords, ISIS fighters, and Iranian proxies, the narrative had to evolve. So it did. New slogans emerged. Nation building, hearts and minds, fighting them over there so we don't fight them here. Each new phase of war came with a new rationale, a new moral justification. The purpose was always noble. The end all was just a little further out. Meanwhile, media played its role. Major networks aired war briefings live. Embedded reporters traveled with troops, often showing the soldiers' bravery but not always the cost. Civilian casualties, drone mishaps, covert operations, those were harder stories to tell. They didn't fit the heroism narrative. Hollywood helped too. From American Sniper to Zero Dark 30, stories of valor and vengeance dominated screens. The message was consistent. America's wars may be complicated, but the people who fight them are righteous. And the mission, even when bloody, is ultimately just. But these narratives did more than boost morale. They sanitized complexity. Few Americans were told about the tribal politics of Afghanistan, the sectarian divides of Iraq, or the global blowback from drone campaigns. War was simplified into a moral obligation, not a strategic choice. Leaders from both parties fed the machine. Republican and Democrat alike used the language of duty and sacrifice to defend continued presence overseas. And if doubts were raised, they were often brushed aside with one phrase: support the troops. Questioning the mission became conflated with disloyalty. Critics were labeled unpatriotic, naive, or dangerous. That culture of silence, fueled by fear, guilt, and post-9/11's trauma, allowed the wars to stretch on with little public pushback. In time, war became normalized. New generations grew up knowing nothing but a world at war. It became part of the background, rarely front-page news, rarely a political priority. And when it did appear, it was almost always in the language of defense, not offense. Even technological shifts helped maintain the illusion. With drones and special forces, war became cleaner, quieter, more invisible. Fewer American deaths meant less public outrage, and that, in turn, meant less pressure to change course. At the heart of it all is the belief that America must lead, that it is the indispensable nation, that if we don't fight, chaos will win. This conviction turns optional wars into moral imperatives, and military dominance into a form of global stewardship. Yet behind the curtain, realpolitik always lurks. The talk is freedom, but the moves are often about oil, influence, and geopolitical positioning. And every now and then, a whistleblower, a declassified memo, or a leaked video peels back the mask and reminds us that war is never just a story. Still, the narrative endures, because it's comforting. It tells Americans that our wars are different, that our motives are pure, and that our soldiers fight not for conquest but for peace. It allows us to wage endless war without reckoning with its contradictions. In the end, the forever wars are not just sustained by force, they are sustained by faith. Faith in the mission, faith in the nation, and above all, faith in the story we tell ourselves, that no matter how long we stay for the right reasons. Part 9. The new battlegrounds. From cyber to space, the war expands. As boots on the ground begin to fade from the headlines, America's wars are not ending, they're evolving. The next front lines won't always be deserts or mountains. They'll be digital, orbital, invisible, the forever. Wars are expanding into new domains where the battlefield has no borders and the enemy might be a line of code. The US military once fought wars with tanks and troops. Now, it fights with algorithms and satellites. Cyber warfare, artificial intelligence, space dominance, these are no longer futuristic concepts. They're operational realities. And America is investing heavily to own the next battlefield. Cyber warfare is already reshaping global conflict. From Chinese data theft to Russian ransomware, adversaries now attack banks, power grids, hospitals, not with bombs, but with malware. The US has quietly built Cyber Command into a major force, capable of launching digital strikes against foreign networks and infrastructure. In 2010, a US-Israeli cyber weapon called Stuxnet was used to cripple Iran's nuclear centrifuges without firing a shot. That marked the first known use of software to carry out a strategic attack. It also kicked off a digital arms race that hasn't slowed since. Now, Pentagon's strategy is shifting from response to persistent engagement. In plain English, preemptive cyber operations, constant surveillance, and digital sabotage before conflicts even begin. It's a 24/7 battlefield and most Americans never see it. Then there's space. Once the domain of astronauts and satellites, it's now considered a warfighting domain. In 2019, the US officially created the Space Force, tasked with defending America's interests beyond Earth's atmosphere. Why space? Because satellites control GPS, communications, targeting systems, drones, and missiles. If a rival takes out your satellites, they blind your military. And nations like China and Russia are already developing anti-satellite weapons. To stay ahead, America is launching constellations of low-orbit satellites, building space-based sensors, and testing orbital weapon systems. It's no longer science fiction, it's strategic necessity. And it's happening in real time, without any global rules to stop it. Artificial intelligence is another silent revolution. The Pentagon is pouring billions into autonomous systems that can analyze data, identify threats, and even make targeting decisions. From AI-assisted drones to battlefield analytics, the machines are becoming commanders' closest allies, maybe one day. But these new domains come with new risks. A cyber-attack misread as an act of war could trigger real-world retaliation. An AI glitch could mistake civilian infrastructure for a military target. A hacked satellite could turn off a country's eyes and ears in seconds. The lines between war and peace are blurred. In this new era, America doesn't need to deploy troops to be at war. A drone strike in Yemen, a cyber operation in Moscow, a satellite disruption over Asia, all can happen without public knowledge or congressional approval. That's strategic by design. These new tools allow the US to project power globally without political cost. No body bags, no battlefield footage, just silent operations in the shadows, conducted by coders, pilots, and analysts in air-conditioned rooms. And the private sector is deeply involved. Tech giants, defense startups, and data firms are now essential players in America's war machine. From Palantir to SpaceX, the military-industrial complex is evolving into a military tech complex, reshaping both defense and Silicon Valley. Yet the public remains largely unaware. There are no parades for cyber warriors, no protests against space weapons. These new battlegrounds remain hidden from daily life, but their impact could be just as devastating as any conventional war. The forever wars haven't ended, they've shifted into dimensions we can't always see. In cyberspace, in orbit, in artificial intelligence, America is fighting new wars with old instincts, dominance, deterrence, and the fear of falling behind. The front lines have moved, but the mission never stopped. Part 10, Endless Ends. Why the forever wars may never truly end. America's wars used to end with treaties, parades, and dates etched into history, books VE Day, VJ Day, the fall of Saigon. But today, the forever wars end with a whisper, if at all. No clear victory, no clear exit, just a slow fade, rebranding, or redeployment. In 2021, the US left Afghanistan, the longest war in its history. But even as the last plane lifted off from Kabul, drone strikes continued. Special forces remained in nearby regions. Surveillance persisted. The headlines read withdrawal, but the war simply changed uniforms. Why can't America walk away? One reason is fear of what happens next. Intelligence officials warn of power vacuums, terrorist resurgence, collapsed allies. Every pullback becomes a gamble. If we leave, will chaos follow? Then there's momentum. After 2 decades of war, institutions, policies, and economies have adapted around it. The Pentagon has permanent bases across the globe. Contractors have multi-billion-dollar Congress funds military operations with barely a debate. Stopping the war machine is harder than starting it. America's global identity also plays a role. Since World War II, the US has styled itself as the world's protector, a force for order, democracy, and deterrence. Backing out of a fight can look like retreat, and for many leaders, appearing weak is worse than being wrong. Public opinion, surprisingly, isn't the main barrier. Most Americans supported leaving Afghanistan. Many are weary of endless war, but in Washington those voices don't always translate into policy. Elections pass, wars stay. What's more, the definition of war itself has blurred. If there are no US troops dying, no big battles televised, can we even call it war anymore? Special ops, drone strikes, cyber attacks, they're sanitized, hidden, bureaucratic. That makes them easier to continue and harder to end. There's also the politics of plausible deniability. Covert missions and classified operations shield us. When things go wrong, the public rarely finds out. When they go right, they're often spun into proof that the mission must continue. And so the wars shift. From Iraq to Syria, from Afghanistan to the Sahel, from boots to bots. But they never quite end. They just rebrand. War on terror becomes counterterrorism. Invasion becomes advisory support. Withdrawal becomes strategic repositioning. Meanwhile, new threats fill the void. Russia, China, the names and technologies change, but the pattern remains. There's always a reason to keep fighting. Always a new frontier that justifies military readiness and action. Yet for all this power, America rarely achieves decisive outcomes in its forever wars. Afghanistan is run by the Taliban again. Iraq remains fractured. Terrorist groups still operate under different banners. If success is the goal, we should ask, what does winning even look like now? Some argue that the goal is no longer victory, it's containment. Not peace, but stability. Not transformation, but control. If that's true, then America isn't fighting to win these wars, it's fighting to manage them. Forever, but that comes at a cost. The longer wars go on, the more truth, transparency, and accountability erode. The more money disappears into black budgets. The more young soldiers grow up in a country that's always fighting but never quite sure why. Still, there is another path. Endings don't have to be surrender, they can be strategy. They can be the result of hard choices, diplomacy, honesty, and a reimaging of what true strength looks like. Leaving a war can be a victory if it's done with purpose. The forever wars may not have a clean end, but perhaps that's the lesson. That endless conflict isn't inevitable, it's chosen. And just as it was chosen, it can be undone. The question is whether America is ready to face that truth and act on it. The forever wars didn't start with one enemy or one battlefield. They began with a mindset that America must always be ready, always engaged, and never retreat. From the deserts of the Middle East to the digital shadows of cyberspace, this documentary unpacks the truth behind why US conflicts rarely end and who benefits when they continue. It's a story of power, fear, policy, and profit where victory is redefined, and withdrawal is often just a repositioning. As we trace decades of hidden deals, military inertia, and shifting threats, one fact becomes clear. America's longest wars aren't just fought with bombs, they refought with silence. And until the nation redefines what strength truly means, the war that never ends may be the one we keep choosing. Subscribe for more documentary. Peace.